So what's going on there with the smoke and the fires? Are you affected by all of that?
Well, we're not affected right now in any danger of fires. So that's great news. There's a lot of people in far worse situations. And we've had, a couple of employees who lost their homes earlier on in the fires a few weeks back. And right now, the entire Northern California, it seems, and of course up the coast all the way up to Washington, are dealing with immense amount of smoke and poor air quality. But we're not impacted at the moment for us with our grapes. Many of the grapes are in, and any grapes that are still out there are, at this point, we're going to do lab analysis always, but at this point, the grapes are pretty locked in. It's not like having smoke back in like July, when you've pre-veraison, or even, or like, when you have hail, for example, in June, and you knock a grape right off, the vine, then you're done. Smoke inside a younger part of the season, you've got smoke really deep inside the berry, and that can be really bad. But right now, we're not dealing with that.
So the smoke didn't affect when you were doing the harvest. You harvest according to schedule, and you just got
correct.
Okay.
Correct. And then the other layer has been COVID and staying safe in the vineyards with masks and distancing when you can, and always wearing masks, and then distance when you can. A wacky year around the world, of course, and agriculture is dealing with their own set of circumstances right now. It's far worse in Oregon right now. Some of the risks they're having in their wine country because the fires are so close. And so we know what that's like from earlier this year for other, appellations in California and previous years. Hello, Jeff Meisel. Great to see you guys again. Yeah. And I am the Vice President of Brand Development for Stony Hill Vineyard and Long Meadow Ranch Wine Estates. Stony Hill became part of the Long Meadow Ranch family back just about 3 years ago. And it's been a great way for Long Meadow Ranch to take on an iconic property such as Stony Hill. And so let's start with the history of Stony Hill and how we got to 2020, because it's a long, 70 plus year history, and it's fascinating. So imagine this backdrop behind me, this virtual backdrop on Spring Mountain, the Spring Mountain AVA in Napa Valley, and think of 1943 for a minute. Okay, we're going back to 1943, and Fred and Eleanor McCrae were visiting friends up on Spring Mountain who had a property above this one. And they were visiting, they were going on a hike, and they saw this goat farm, and it just seemed like a special place. They had a love for wine already. They were a San Francisco couple and family, and loved the wines of Burgundy, and saw this spot and had the crazy idea of making wine. And it took a few years, and then by 1947, they were planting grapes. And at this time, when they were searching, they wanted to make Chardonnay in Napa Valley. And back then, there was no Chardonnay in Napa Valley. But they had this idea from their love of Burgundy, that's what they wanted to do. When they were seeking out, looking for grapes, looking for some, cuttings to plant, they went to the school, and they went to other areas, and someone's like, "You want to plant Chardonnay in Napa Valley?" Like, what? Like, yeah, we do. Like, well, please plant some other things too. So they got the Chardonnay from the Wente family, the Wente clone, which actually goes back to Charles Whitmore, who brought it over in the 1870s from Meursault, and it became the Wente clone out in Lodi. So that was the primary Chardonnay, and they were convinced to plant some other things. No one suggested Cabernet, by the way. That was not even in the equation. It was plant some Riesling, plant some Gewürztraminer, plant some Pinot Blanc. So they did that. The Riesling has been incredible. Gewürztraminer incredible. Pinot Blanc lasted like a year, and they didn't really like what the results were. So they pulled that out, planted more Chardonnay. And so it began. 1952 was the first commercial release of Chardonnay, Riesling, Gewürztraminer. And that's where it all begins. And it was from this period through today that very little has changed in the original philosophy and idea around making Chardonnay on this property. And there's a variety of reasons why Chardonnay works up here, and doesn't take on some of that, all that richness and that we see in other areas, and takes on that lean, amazing character. But going first to the story of like the business and the family, that first batch of wines, that first release went to, it was a letter written by Fred and Eleanor to their friends, and their friends replied, writing checks, and then came up to pick up the wine. And so it was the first mailing list DTC, direct to consumer wine that we know of on record, and with the oldest, Chardonnay, in Napa Valley. And so it begins, and they make, now, that being said, the wines are incredible. So the story is only as good as the wine quality, right? So the wines have this sense of place on Spring Mountain. So in the heart of Napa Valley, Spring Mountain AVA right here is this block above St. Helena. So to the north of us is Diamond Mountain District. To the south is sort of this no man's land. That's where the Longmeadow Ranch, home ranch is. And then just south of that, you've got the Yountville. And then to the valley floor, you've got the St. Helena AVA in purple. You've got Rutherford in green. And we've got, again, Oakville and things like that. Okay. So within this appellation, we're getting into the Spring Mountain AVA, which was established in 1993. There was, of course, not many appellations going on in the 1950s, 40s and 50s. And in fact, we're just talking about a handful of wineries at the time. So Spring Mountain is this whole area, and you'll see this is Highway 29, okay? That's going north up this direction. You can see north. You'll notice that we're on the northeast section of Spring Mountain. In fact, most of Spring Mountain, you go up Spring Mountain Road to go up to most of the wineries. We are not there. We are going up the backside by the Belgrist Mill. And so we're bordering all this parkland up here. And this Mill Creek cuts through wonderful stream, and there's lots of other small streams and creeks and waterfalls. Some are, out, and some are inside the mountain itself, hence the name Spring Mountain. So lots of water in the mountain, both depending on the time of year. You might have an outside waterfall, or you have water running inside. We've got 700 feet elevation up to 1,500 feet elevation. And you'll also notice that we've got this sort of northeast exposure for most of the vineyards, a very key component to the slow ripening, the coolness that helps the Chardonnay. The Cabernet block at the top actually has a little bit more. It's actually going this direction and this direction. So we're actually getting some unique positions on this one little vineyard of Cab that's getting some more southern exposure, and even a little bit of an angle. It's a little bit west, but it's not too much because you've got the mountain behind you. So there's all these layers of the mountain. So we're not at the top. In fact, there's another steep slope above us that goes up to Smith Madrone, and the Smith Madrone is sort of at the next level above us, to give you some context. This is where we host tastings, right on the terrace of Fred and Eleanor's house where they used to live. And now we are facing east. Okay, so this is the Vaca range out here. Okay, that's the eastern slopes. So of course, this is to the north, south. Okay, so we're looking at this way. So now we get a little bit more of an understanding of this exposition that we have. And it's a really just a little slice of paradise to sit up here on this terrace and taste. So now another perspective, still looking, okay, so we're still looking to the east now. And now we're getting a sense of all this fog, that we are above, not always, but in this situation, we're above the fog. And we get this air conditioning, right? This natural air conditioning from this. So this is one of the primary blocks of Chardonnay, one of the original blocks. And this is a Riesling block as you go farther up the hill, the original block. And in fact, these vines are still from the original plantings from 1947, 48.
Oh, that's incredible.
Yeah, and they're still going into the wine.
Is that unusual to have vines last that long?
Yeah, well, it's not unusual globally to have vines that last that long. It's definitely not common here in California. You see it with some old Zinfandel and old other Italian, varietals in the Amador foothills, some older Barbera. But because of a variety of reasons, whether it's disease or whether it's just lower yields, and then as the onslaught of commercial agriculture came into play, it just wasn't really considered, right? You would think, I want to maximize my yields. And for this vineyard and for the philosophy and the operation, it wasn't always about maximizing yields. It was about maximizing the quality of the wine. And the grapes were still coming off that were very good. So there are a couple of younger blocks that just needed to be done. But we have been restoring these vineyards with organic farming, really working the soil, and we're seeing some renewed vigor in even some of these vines. Now, it's not going to go maybe another 50 years, some of those vines, but the fact that we can still get amazing grapes on some of these vines is really a special attribute to the property. Now, the Chardonnay didn't do as well. Riesling is known to have a longer life in this area, in the vine. Now, so again, this idea that, think about this picture for a moment and think about where the photographer is. To the right and behind the photographer, we have the forest, right? So we have, and that's going west, behind us. So we're losing the sun at a much earlier time of the day. So this natural air conditioning combined with this incredible sort of just effect of losing the sun, we're getting a cooler climate, right? We're getting grapes that have a more temperate climate than you would think for what you would call Napa Valley, right? And this is why the Riesling does mature so beautifully. This is why the Chardonnay is able to produce these kinds of wines of texture, combined, of course, with the soil, which we'll get to next.
I had read that the vineyards were dry farmed. Maybe
Yes.
you can explain what dry farming is.
Absolutely. So this is a really incredible part of Stony Hill's history and legacy that we've continued. And the vineyard was dry farmed from the very beginning, which means there was no irrigation lines, no watering. And because we're on Spring Mountain, there's a good water table, right? But it's a very risky proposition, if you think about it nowadays, to not have irrigation, because you want to be prepared for things like droughts. But dry farming for the vines creates more stress as the vines are seeking the nutrients and the water down below. So they're always digging in, and they're going to get that complexity by digging, finding their water, finding their food down below. It's not a false sense of security, right? Irrigation can be that false sense. Think about a plant and it's going up to get their nutrients. They might not go as deep in the root system. And we want complexity. We want that stress of the vines. And doing that here has been incredible, because that's a huge part of this. Now, to the balance. Now, as we've continued, the newest thing, we had a new vineyard that we were able to replant because it was fallow due to a variety of reasons. When we acquired it, one of the reasons they had to, sell the property was, in part, it needed a lot of maintenance. It was about like a roof, a fallow vineyard, turning fully organic, from Napa green to fully organic. Those things take time and money. So with those investments, we replanted a Chardonnay block and a block that had some Gewürztraminer that we switched over to Chardonnay. But one thing we did lay irrigation just for those first 3 years. So 2018, 2019, 2020, and then by next year, we will pull up the irrigation lines as those vines are now ready to go in. And then we won't even start using the grapes for another couple of years from that vine. It's probably 5 to 6 years in. But then the vines have enough of a root system, still very young, but enough to feel confident in our dry farming. And we really want that. So the combination of the dry farming, the tilling and the working of the soil, the composting that we're doing, the cover crops to attract predators, attract the right kind of insects, all these things go to making a balance in the vineyard. And that balance comes from all those things. And then on top of that, it goes to how they are being trellised, how they're being, how they're being managed. And this photo and the next couple will sort of continue that process. So in addition to those things we just mentioned, we're doing a lot of work around and under each vine. We're making every effort to bring life and energy from that vineyard so we can get that and transport that into the final glass of wine. And that's probably one of the things that Eleanor and Fred, Fred was the first winemaker, and then Mike Collini, who had the longest tenure in Napa Valley until he retired last year in 2018. But every element was always about that. And now we're taking that one step further in our work in the vineyards. And we're able to bring that team and those resources that we bring. And with Stefan Vivier as the winemaker now, and really understanding that he's learned so much from Mike and from the site. And now we're able to really take care of every vineyard vine by vine. And you will see, this was the off season, you'll see there isn't much growth here going on, but you'll notice there's no trellising. We removed the trellising and the canes, and we've gone back to the gobelets pruning. And this also is to helping to reboot the energy. So what we do is, I'm gonna put my pen here again, and I'm gonna draw a couple of things. So you can see it, right? We remove the trellising, right?
Right.
And then the next thing, you'll see we've created this space. So then they're gonna grow out on their own, and they are then going to create a shade canopy. And then we will work with the best selection that are there that have the best potential for balanced fruit for the season.
So removing the trellising is to make the vine stronger?
So basically, yes, by doing that, we're only keeping this one wood plank here with a little zip tie around it, and to kind of hold that in place. But we want them to do their natural work to create their natural energy. And by doing that, we're creating more balance between the root system and the fruit that's growing. It's an older technique that's been done in Burgundy, and because we have vines that are old enough in age that have the sturdiness, we're able to do this, working that soil and creating that energy and health. We started the organic conversion in 2017, just before we acquired it in 2018. And now they'll be certified by 2020, end of the year. But all of these things are factors, right? It's multifactorial that goes into this balance that we're talking about. And of course, the next phase of that multifactorial component is, working it during the season, and of course, harvest and when we harvest, and then the gentle approach in the cellar.
Did Long Meadow Ranch purchase the vineyard directly from the original family of Stony Hill?
Yes. Oh yeah. So it only has been in the hands of the McRae family and then Long Meadow Ranch, and it was really a really interesting acquisition because Ted and Laddie and Chris Hall from Long Meadow Ranch have been friends with the McRae family for many years, and Ted goes back a long, long time. And so this acquisition was quite unique in that Fred and Eleanor's son, Peter McRae, is now on the board of the Long Meadow Ranch Wine Estates company, right? So he's part of the family, and that sort of connective tissue is really important. And Sarah McRae, Fred's granddaughter, Peter's daughter, is my colleague, and she's VP of Marketing and Strategy with the company. So there's a lot of connectiveness that has continued. And then the transition of Mike Collini retiring to Stefan Vivier was quite natural. And Stefan, who's from Burgundy, who's our Anderson Valley winemaker for the Burgundian varietals, the Chardonnay and Pinot Noir at that Anderson Valley property, was a natural fit to join and become the winemaker at Stony Hill. And it's a really wonderful transition. And it's a special Stefan really excited and happy about it because he's known about this property for years. His mentor, Albert de Villan from DRC, has loved this property for years. This is quite a unique spot in Napa Valley history, but also for the future.
Does that make it easier to harvest without the trellis?
No, it doesn't impact that component because it's actually more inconsistent for the pickers, right? When you trellis, you're sort of forcing the vines positioning, and you'll have maybe some more consistency, but not necessarily for us. This is not globally. You might have more consistency and easier to pick, but you might not maximize each vine. Okay. That's our decisions. We don't do this at other properties. It's unique to Stony Hill, and I think that's important. These are not prescriptive measures by any stretch. These are measures that we've done here because of this site specifically. A little bit of a grafting project. So we were talking earlier about the Wente clone and Meursault. And so when we had an opportunity based on the health of a couple little blocks, we sort of went old and new coming together. So we worked with a great nursery here in California who has a wonderful Meursault clones that we took, and that goes back actually to what we were talking about before with Charles Whitmore and the Meursault clones in the 1870s. So now we have other old vine Meursault clones in the vineyard along with those old Wente clones in other blocks. So we're really excited about the pedigree, the heirloom pedigree of these Chardonnay clones in the vineyard. And we're looking ahead, again, like I said, for the next 70 years ahead. The future, is kind of bright. We're really, really excited about that. We grafted it. So you graft it, you take 1 year in that redo. So we have a little bit of grafting that was done in 18 that we'll see in the 19 vintage, but most of what we'll see from the grafting was done in 19. So we'll see that in the 2020 vintage, if that makes sense. You lose one season when you do the grafting project.
Okay.
And so that mixing of heirloom, old and new is a really thing. So when we did that with 2 blocks so far. But we also look at, not always do we have to do this. Not always do we try not to replant. What we have done, we've reshaped a vineyard. We've repositioned a vineyard, thinking about what we look to also is what's happening, what has been happening with sun positioning, heat spikes. How do we want to maximize our shading, right? That was a big piece of that trellising we talked about. And when we reposition, reshape a vineyard, same thing there. We look at the canopy management, the natural canopy management, as well as what our team can do to maximize that. So by reshaping and repositioning, we're looking at the road direction, and we're looking at the soil analysis, and we're looking at the long-term future of farming a vineyard. So here's a shot a little later in the season where you can see some more activity, of course, really starting to bloom there. These were taken probably in June. So we're really starting to see what's happening. So you can also see where we've made some cuts, right, to allow these to come, but then cut off other areas, right? Cut off there to allow this one to grow. You can even see a little cut right there, right, to allow this one to grow. And then you'll see this one here, whether or not that maintains or not. And you can see, look at the sturdiness and the hardy older vine, about 30 years old here. This, much older, this is a Riesling vine from that old block going back to 1947, 48. And again, you can look at what's happened. You can see we're going to have fruit coming off in multiple places here this year. So look at that. I mean, that's a 70-plus-year-old vine. We talked about cover crop before and organic farming. You'll see a lot of great cover crop in here. Again, we're trying to attract insects. We're trying to get the life and energy in the vine, in the whole vineyard. And again, stages of life, things growing, you feel it. And I'll go back again to Stefan. He was talking with Aubert de Villaine. He was recently with him in California, actually, back in just before COVID in February. And Aubert from DRC, he was recalling his first visit to Stony Hill. And he remembered, instantly taken to the energy and the special component, and tasting the wines and recognizing texture, freshness, the tension, right? Tension, acid, fresh, brightness, delicate, all these things coming together. And that is the goal. Like for Stefan making wine, his goal is to preserve and represent those elements. And when you taste these wines, you taste that precision, you taste the tension. The acidity is clearly there. Otherwise, these wines wouldn't age the way they do. And Stony Hill is known for their ageability and known for releasing some wines a little bit later for restaurants and consumers, and because they're aging so well. And as we continue this sort of photo essay, and we turn to winemaking, we'll talk about what we're doing there as we take vineyard to cellar, cellar to glass. Again, here's another good shot. This is, of course, different season, but again, you see that fog impact. Again, this was probably just after harvest, so everything's in, but again, it shows you the seasons at Stony Hill. And again, the Riesling vineyard is here. And I keep showing you sort of this main vineyard because it really indicates a lot. And then Chardonnay block 8, and then way up here above this hillside is the Cabernet block. And more Chardonnay up here, and then more Chardonnay down, lower down in the vineyard.
And all the vineyards are picked by hand.
Yes, yes. And with that in mind, perfectly timed. This was taken about a week or so ago, first day of harvest. The shadow is that of the winemaker taking the picture. And you can see the team is going through. There's a little cart that carries the larger crate, and they're out there with the small baskets, cutting by hand, dropping grapes in, and then they bring them to the little trailer, and they fill it up, and then they drive that. And in this particular case, they will drive it across this way down to the winery, which is back here.
So is the picking crew the same every year?
Yeah, so we're really fortunate. And that's one of the great things at Long Meadow Ranch, is that we have our team. Not in the Anderson Valley. Anderson Valley, well, it's the same team, but we contract them. But these are employees of the Long Meadow Ranch Wine Estates company, which includes Stony Hill. And that's really great for us, right? We're able to have our team, and then our vineyard manager, our enologist, our winemakers. It's a great big team all working together. And then as the grapes come in, so this is Stefan Vivier, our winemaker. Not glamorous, but this is an important piece of the operation right here. Putting it into this new, very high-tech but very gentle press that we got in the off season. The hand stomping Stefan we make a tiny production of a rosé up at Stony Hill. And it only sells out the tasting room and our mailing list. And it's the old school style of stomping before they get pressed. And that's a little more. And then this is Syrah that came in 2 days ago. There's a little bit of Syrah that's also just direct to consumer only. One little block, less than an acre of Syrah up there. There's a shot of Stefan.
That's good.
In the vineyard, going through and giving us a little education one day. We were out in the field. The Stony Hill cellar, and we cleaned it up a little bit with a new floor, but it's just old French oak in here, old barrels, and there's none of the red wines go in here. Of course, we mentioned there's a little bit of Syrah, a little bit of Cabernet, but they are not made in this winery. They were never made there because they were always very clear that they did not want to have malolactic fermentation in the Chardonnay. They wanted to keep the texture more precise and less voluptuous. So having red wines in there could have triggered malolactic fermentation in the cellar, right? Because things are living and breathing, right? Yeasts are alive, things are airborne, fermentation's airborne. So they didn't want to have that happen, so they were never made in there. So this is just for the Chardonnay, and Riesling's made in here, Gewürztraminer made in here. And then now, so that's the outside of this building. The doors that we were just looking at are right here, facing this way. Okay, so that's the perspective. It's tiny. Here's the old press that when they got that in the, I think it was like the early 80s, it was quite modern, a pneumatic press, to be as gentle as possible. Right? That was the idea, to be gentle with the fruit. You want to keep that elegance, that precision. It's really important to have a gentle press. And so this new press from Italy, and it's, again, it's quite modern, but it's all about being able to be gentle and slow. So we can do a 3-hour low pressure press, keeping the acid and the freshness intact. Same ideas from the 70s when they, actually, yeah, so there was probably mid 70s that one. Same idea as in the 70s when Mike started making the wine, which was cutting edge, as I said. Same things, but it's all about that gentle component. So that's where we saw Stefan unloading those grapes into that, and that in the tractor before. And so then, so this is the only, like, this is like the, this is what we call the new crush pad. That's all we did. There was no crush, quote unquote, crush pad there. That's the new addition. And then this is the new addition. So in the room, so now the barrels that we saw are back here. The doors that we saw are just over here. So when you come in for a tasting, when you come visit one day, we can't wait to see you. We'll walk down that hill past the vineyard from the house. We'll walk past the press and we'll come in these doors here with a glass of wine in hand. And you'll see how simple it is. You'll see neutral French oak barrels. You'll see these 3 tanks, which actually, it's almost like 4 tanks in one. This is actually a split tank. There's 2 tanks here. And the reason why that's great is because we get 2 for 1. We have very small lots that come in. And so it's actually 2 tanks in one. And so Stefan really likes to start fermentation in stainless steel for Chardonnay. He likes it, again, going back to those same things we talked about with the soil and the press, and now to fermentation. It's great for keeping that brightness, the flavor, and the texture in the fruit. He loves doing this before then going into the oak for the full fermentation. Okay, so these are the tanks. It's that simple. And all we did, we got these, Calbrigo Italian stainless steel, custom made for us. But before that, they were just, there was 1 stainless steel tank and these old Foudres. And so it wasn't glamorous. It might have seemed like, oh, that's so wonderful, but really it was impractical, right? So now we can get all the fruit that's coming in, and it's not a lot, but we can get all of it into steel quickly. And that's important for the integrity of the wine, right? So these small little things that are sort of behind the scenes are helping us continue what our goal is to bring that fresh, bright, precise wines with acid that will age for the future in the best possible way. We put a new roof in, the roof needed replacements. We sealed the floor because there were some leaks. It's like, it's not glamorous, but that's how important some of this stuff is. And that's what we've been doing. And so I'm going to pause there. And now we'll talk about going into the oak, right? So now they go into the neutral oak, and they'll go in for about, it's 12 to 18 months. Hover slightly. I'm going to pull up stats on an individual wine, for example, with, like, let's say the 16 or 17 or 18 Chardonnay, but it hovers slightly. And I really focus on Chardonnay in this discussion because that's really sort of the legacy and the core identity of Stony Hill. Now, Riesling, of course, is incredible and important, and my mouth waters when I look at the bottle on your desk, or I look at the bottle here in my hand that I'm having for dinner tonight. It's it's a beautiful, beautiful wine. Don't get me wrong. I like talking about Chardonnay because that's that's the pedigree and the future for sure.
Your new crush pad with that one machine out there, that handles all the grapes?
Yeah, so they come in stages though, right? Nothing's coming in such massive, and it's going in for about 3 hours. So we bring them in, they go in, we lay it across that bladder, and it slowly sits, and it's a low pressure, slow for about 3 hours, and then they go into tank.
3 hours seems like a long time for that one machine. I mean, do you have grapes backed up waiting to go in, or because you harvest right when you harvest, it goes right into the crusher?
Yeah, so the team that brings the grapes down will then, let's say it's a day that we're harvesting a lot, and really sometimes because it's our team, we might do blocks 8 and 9 today, we might do blocks 10 and 12 tomorrow, right? So everything's not being picked at the exact same time, and that's a really important benefit of having your own team. We're going for our best day, our best time to harvest, not when we contracted a team to come in.
Yeah, I can see that.
And I talk about that a lot in Anderson Valley, where we don't have our own team, but we pick earlier than everyone over at Long Meadow Ranch, Anderson Valley Estate, so we can hedge and postpone a day or call it a day early because of that component. So yeah, so it's a good question, but we're never really, a small winery typically wouldn't have 2 presses anyway. Those are very expensive machines. And if you ever do have a backup, one of the little things that is often talked about, but it's common and it's totally natural. Sometimes you'll see wineries put dry ice on the grapes, resting some blocks of dry ice, which does nothing to the grapes themselves, but it keeps them cool if you are in a waiting game. You'll notice in the label, and people ask this a lot, why does it say white Riesling? And it's just Riesling, but back when this started, it was Johannesburg Riesling back in the 50s. And then with global trademark laws, you couldn't say that anymore. And they put white in front of Riesling just because.
Because that's better than just saying Riesling?
Yeah, I mean, like maybe somebody in marketing was like, "Oh, you better put white Riesling so people know." And, I'm sure there's an extra story in there that I need to ask Sarah McCrae about. But yeah, it's that simple. But the key component with the Riesling and also the Gewürztraminer, they're dry, and they have this old world sensibility, just like the Chardonnay, with this Napa Valley, ripeness. And so I was listening to a sommelier friend of mine. She was on with another sommelier friend. So Amanda McCrossin was chatting, and they were talking about how, with Vanessa Conlon, who's a master of wine, and they were talking about this Riesling and how, like, you can't pinpoint, say, oh, it's exactly like this kind of Riesling, Austria, and even within Austria, is it like the Wachau, or is it like Kremstal, or is it like something in Germany, Falls? You can't really, it's so hard to do that with wine. But what they did agree, and Amanda was talking about how it has some of the austerity of an Austrian dry Riesling, but it also has some of that texture that you might expect more in Germany. And I would agree with that sentiment. But again, it's so hard to ever say, oh, it reminds me of this, because it's not fair to any of the components, right? It's not fair to the wines from that place, nor is it fair to our estate. But I think the takeaway is that this is a wine that has texture, it has intensity, it has these dry petrol, and of course the aging of Riesling, we know those flavor profiles really do change over time, right? In their youth, they might get some of this petrol and then they take on this other texture. I mean, even our Chardonnay has some of those Riesling petrol-y components in their youth, and then they really evolve in their age. So I think when you taste that Riesling and you have it with some food and you watch it evolve in your glass, and I would say stretch it out 2 days, I would say with the same thing with the Chardonnay. Really, and if anyone out there is already has had Stony Hill or is about to look for some, open that bottle and enjoy it over a couple of days, because they really do evolve. These are, the same way I think about wines in Friuli or German wines, where like you watch them open up, the white wines, you watch them open with oxygen over a day or two, and they become more magical and more layered. And if you have the willpower to age these wines, to lay them down, it will bring you great joy for sure. I remember a few years ago, I had a 25-year-old Stony Hill. I had a 1994 Stony Hill Chardonnay in 2014, I guess it was. Yeah, so it was 2014, I had 94. And I still, I remember where I was. I was at a restaurant in San Francisco at A16, and we had this wine, and it just brought me right back to the vineyard, which I had been to long before. I had been to Stony Hill in 1998 when I was a 25-year-old living in Napa, and I was taken there, but it brought me right back to the place. And as the wine opened up, the acid was still there, the layers, the secondary flavors were coming into play. And it was not Burgundy, it was not somewhere else. I was at Stony Hill. I was in this little pocket of Napa Valley, this unique pocket, gravelly soils, stony, gravelly loam, just texture and precise acidity. It really, it's a gem.
Well, that's really good to know, because a lot of times people are wonder about, storage of wines, and also when they open the wines, how quickly should they be drinking them? Because I think a lot of times people think they should drink them fairly quickly because they don't want the air to get to the wines. And
totally, especially with white wines, right? We're trained, and I say we, the collective we, are trained to drink them and not think about day two. And really, it's important also because sometimes with the Stony Hill wines, the older ones, with all wines, but Stony Hill I can speak to because that's what we're talking about today. When you open a wine with 4 or 5 years on it, you might get something funky at first. That first hit of wine to oxygen in the glass, it's not all there. You need to get oxygen swirling around. If you ever had the chance to have the wines of Nicolas Joly, I think about that, right? Those wines come out of the glass, you're like, whoa, we need some air, we need some time. And it's not that funky by any stretch. The Chenin Blanc from Loire is what I'm speaking of, from Nicolas Joly. But this idea that you need oxygen to open up these wines. And it's funny, we're talking with Stefan, however, Stefan really likes looking at the younger wines to think about his next wine, right? He has not made these wines for so many years yet. So he's looking at what's happening with the 18 and the 17 and the 16 to think about the short life, not of that's when people will drink them, but just to think about when they're being made. What's the acid profile in its youth to give it context for the future? How will this acid develop over, and maintain for longevity? And then I would say also at Stony Hill, and they've always done this, and we continue the legacy, they've always released more than one wine, more than one vintage at a time for the Chardonnays. So for example, we have the 2011 currently available for our consumers, and the brand new release 18. We just switched from 17 to 18, just like last week. But that idea, that spread, is that we've done the aging for you. And there's a slight increase in price, but not too much. So we've done the aging because we want our customers to experience that. And then there's a middle vintage available for the restaurant clients. We have the 14 vintage and the 11 vintage available for our wholesale customers, our restaurant clients, and a few select retailers out there. But where we sell most of the wine on our website, just like Fred and Eleanor back with the letters, now of course with emails, but it's the 11 and the 16, so 11 and 18, excuse me. That's a really unique proposition for customers to get a wine with some age. It's sort of a personal preference on what one wants out of an aged wine. And I mean that with any wine out there, right? Some people love wines when they do take on those secondary layers or even tertiary layers as a wine gets really old. Red, whether it's Barolo, whether it's Napa Valley Cabernet, whether it's Burgundy or Chardonnay like Stony Hill, things change, right? Profiles change. And it's not for everyone, even though the wine could be great for someone else. So I love that 15-year mark. I think that, the 9-year mark with the 11, yeah, it's gorgeous right now. But I also just had a 2008 recently at a restaurant. And you'll see them around. If you see some restaurants, you might see 2008s out there, or even 7s. But 8 was a spectacular vintage. And in 2020, it's drinking so well. So I can envision that I will still enjoy the 2008 for at least 5 more years. So I personally love that 15-year mark, if I can be patient enough to do so.
But how do you determine how much wine to sell currently and then how much to hold back?
So for us, so from a business standpoint, when we hold back a certain percentage for that library release on the website, and then we shift each year. So we don't have like 2008 to sell right now, for example. We just do that 11. And then we hold back some magnums, as well. Very few. So, and then the wholesale also. So it's a very structured plan of how we allocate the wine. But if we get a run on something, we still have a mark where we stop it so that we'll have that library vintage a few years later.
Okay.
So like to have the fortitude and say, like, let's not take the cash right now and let's hold back some, 18, so we have it in 9 years to sell again. It's not easy. It's not a science. But the good news is, because of those blocks that were fallow, that we replanted in 2018, in basically 10 years, we'll have more wine in the market. Percentage wise, it'll be like about a 20% increase. Without, we didn't buy new vineyards, we just replanted some stuff and we have some more renewed vigor, therefore more yields from some of the existing vineyards because of the conversion to organic farming and working the soil the way we've been doing.
20% would be quite a bit.
Yeah, but it's still a tiny, Stony Hill total production is like 5,000 cases. So, it's still small numbers.
Jeff, as usual, you did a really great presentation. I mean, you're so enthusiastic, and, I hope the rest of the year works out really well with you and the vineyard.
Thank you. And we hope to one day see you up at Stony Hill and Long Meadow Ranch.
Appreciate it. Really enjoyed talking to you. I really learned a lot, as always.
Awesome. Thank you for the time.